Welcome into another episode of the Football Guys Fantasy Football Show. Today, we're going to be ranking the best playoff stashes that are available in at least 40% of leagues. We've brought on a special guest today, Daniel Harms. You can find him on Twitter, X, whatever the kids call it nowadays, at InHarmsWay19. Daniel does a lot of great work for us here over at Football Guys. You can check out his must start video every single week here on the YouTube Football Guys. Gentlemen, I want to start this off by asking, what is your approach to stashing players for the fantasy football playoffs, and how early do you start? Daniel, you're the guest today. Let's start with you.
This is actually something that I've relatively just started to do in most of my leagues, going back maybe 2 or 3 years. And I guess what I like to do is I try to find those playoff matchups. We're looking at the defenses and how they give up points to certain specific areas, and maybe some players that you like. Don't mind my daughter coughing in the background as she's sick today. So I want to get some of the good offenses with good schedules at the end. So you try to find some of those players that maybe have some pop off weeks, but then go back to relegation, and then maybe find a backfield or a wide receiver room where someone's nicked up. Those tend to re-aggravate, and then you find someone, you put them on your bench, because I've obviously had Rashee Rice in about most of my leagues, and they've decided not to use him very much. So he's just kind of sitting there as a stash, waiting to break out at some point, hopefully. So yeah, that's kind of how my process goes. Just trying to find players in good offenses that have that good matchup field towards the end, and then a few nicks, bumps, and bruises here could get them right into those starting positions.
Dave, how about you? What do you end up doing here as you get closer to the playoffs?
So for me, you'll see, especially when we start discussing my rankings, I really prioritize positions more than anything. I think running backs are what I start to prioritize. If you've already got a good solid team, there's no reason to be holding on to a wide receiver 6, wide receiver 7 at this point in the season. Chances are, if your wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 goes down, you're probably going to be SOL. It's just the way it is, unfortunately. And you're probably not going to be getting a lot of value off of the waiver wire at the wide receiver position. But these running backs are the guys that I am trying to just load my bench up with as many as possible. And we're going to talk about a lot of those guys today. We talk about the nicks that can happen late in the season, and where that could open up an opportunity for wide receivers. Typically, we see if a wide receiver gets hurt, those targets are usually spread out among all of the remaining wide receivers. If a running back gets hurt, that's when we can see a guy go from literally riding the pine doing 80-90% snap share. So if you're looking for the guys that have the really high-end upside, which is what you want in the playoffs, I'm trying to stash as many running backs as I possibly can.
Well, that feels like a good jumping off point. Let's take a look at tier number 4 here. We're going to be ranking, like I said, we're going to be ranking the best playoff stashes available in at least 40% of leagues. We're going to start from the bottom up. So at 15, we've got the Atlanta Falcons defense, who have a really nice schedule towards the end of the season in the playoffs. Maybe not the best in week 17, but we'll take a look at that in just a moment. At number 14, Tutu Atwell, wide receiver for the Los Angeles Rams. And at 13, Kareem Hunt. I think that we can just kind of agree here that Tutu Atwell and Kareem Hunt are both sort of just handcuffs here at this point, that if an injury were to happen to the player in front of them, their value could go up exponentially. So, Dave, I'll start with you here first. If Jerome Ford and Cooper Kupp, the incumbents ahead of them, are not available, who would you rather have between Tutu Atwell, who we've seen already have a good year earlier, and Kareem Hunt, who we maybe haven't seen as much, but that running back position is so valuable?
Now, this is one of the very few rare ones where I might prefer the wide receiver, and I rank these guys back to back. Kareem Hunt, I mean, we saw when Jerome Ford missed that Pierre Strong was a little bit more involved than I think a lot of people realize. Pierre Strong has a lot of speed. He's a very good pass catcher, and he's going to have a little bit of a role. I actually did rank Kareem Hunt ahead of Tutu Atwell, but you could twist my arm in either direction here, because we saw before Cooper Kupp came back from IR, Tutu Atwell was a target hog. I mean, obviously Puka Nacua was doing his thing, but there was a point in the season where Tutu Atwell was one of 8 wide receivers who saw 8+ targets in every single game to start the season. So we know that if Cooper Kupp isn't going to be there, Tutu Atwell is plenty involved. Again, it just kind of comes down to who I prefer for the rest of the season. I think Kareem Hunt, being a running back, is going to be a little bit more valuable than what realistically is probably going to be no better than like wide receiver 3 output from Tutu Atwell.
Daniel, I want to ask you here, because at the bottom of this list, we have the Falcons DST. And I'm one of those guys that as I get closer to the playoffs, I just stash usually 3 or 4, as many as my league will allow. And I'm kind of that annoying, fantasy manager in my league. Uh, Is that something that you look to do? Do you try to grab all these defenses? And if so, the Falcons, not every single matchup for them in the playoffs is good, but I would say the
Pretty
first week of
close.
the playoffs, yeah, the first week of the playoffs, they've got Carolina, second week is Indy, and championship week is Chicago. Assuming that Chicago's offense might be pretty good, Indy's offense is sort of hit or miss. Carolina feels like that first week where you think that this Falcons defense might actually get you a win. So how
Mhm.
much does that play into your decision making when adding defenses for the playoffs?
For me, I'm really looking at just keeping two defenses myself. Again, I'm not necessarily at the target, the defense hog myself, but it depends on your league too. Like if you're stacked everywhere else, why not? Why not just keep getting those matchups? And the Falcons, like you said, I like to look at the quarterbacks here: Baker Mayfield, Bryce Young, and then Gardner Minshew. Those three guys are going to be very turnover prone in these games down the stretch. And when you have Tampa Bay against Atlanta, that's a game where Atlanta is going to want to really win because they might be able to win their division still. We'll see how that ends up coming to fruition at the end. But like I said, the one against Chicago might be your one big, I don't know, maybe Justin Fields just kind of
You
runs
never
all over
know.
them. You never really know. He could also turn the ball over quite a few times, and it's hard to really gauge. But like I said, I like the matchups here for the Falcons defense, and they've been a very good overall defense this season, more of an underrated group behind an offense that needed a defense to step up, and they've been able to do that. So I definitely like the strategy of keeping a couple of them. And if you're stacked everywhere else, the Falcons is a definite target to go ahead and add to your teams right now.
And what I want to say is before the playoffs start, I know this is a playoff show, so sorry for kind of going
Yeah,
off script here, but you're getting a very, very usable week from Atlanta's defense in week 13 when they get to go up against the Tim Boyle led New York Jets, which
absolutely.
they might be the number one scoring defense that week. So not only do they have a nice playoff schedule, but they also have a pretty nice schedule leading up to the playoffs.
And I just Dave, let's keep going further down that Tim Boyle trail there. I know
Oh,
a lot of fantasy managers are going to be out there picking up the Miami Dolphins defense this week if they happen to still be available. I know they're not available in many leagues, but they've got the Jets twice to finish out the season here. So yeah, those are
Cleveland,
games that
Cleveland
yeah,
getting
Cleveland
Tim
as
Boyle
well.
in championship week. Oh,
Oh, if you have the Browns defense, hold on to them. Just hold on for dear life. Even if it's not Tim Boyle and it's Trevor Simeon, like I don't imagine it gets much better.
yeah.
All right, let's take a look at tier number 3 here. We're moving up the ranks. At number 12, we've got Russell Wilson, the quarterback for the Broncos. At 11, Noah Brown, wide receiver for the Texans. At 10, Joshua Kelley, running back for the Chargers. And at number 9, let's just make them a pair. Odell Beckham Jr. and Rashod Bateman, the wide receivers for the Baltimore Ravens. And guys, let's start here at the bottom. At number 12, Russell Wilson. Daniel and I both have him ranked at 12. Dave, you ranked him at number 9. It's not that much higher, but you were the outlier in this case. So, Russell Wilson, he's been the quarterback 16 in fantasy points per game. And he's always just kind of been like just in the outskirts of being quarterback 12. He's been a quarterback 12 just once in the last 6 games, but he's always kind of around quarterback 13, 15, something like that. He seems like one of those guys that's going to be matchup dependent. So why is it that you have faith in Russell Wilson come fantasy playoff time?
Well, 'cause he's got some pretty nice matchups in the playoffs. He gets to face off at Houston, and we've seen Houston as a great offense, which leads to a lot of shootouts. He also gets to see Chicago, which hasn't had a great defense. What I'm most concerned about is obviously that Week 17 matchup against the Jets, who have done a great job with their pass rush. But really, this is just some outside of the box thinking here. Did I have that? I might have had that wrong, actually. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
they play the
sorry. He's
Chargers.
got Detroit. He's got the Chargers. I was looking at the wrong team. He's got the Chargers in Week 17, which I really like. Who's given up more fantasy points to quarterbacks than any other positions, and then he's got Detroit, which could be the shootout in Week 15 here. Sorry, I got a little ahead of my notes here, but this is me kind of thinking outside the box a little bit with Russ Wilson. We're seeing this Denver team trend up, and they've been doing that a lot by leaning on their run game. But we've seen Russell Wilson has looked good. He's seen his completion rate go up. He's starting to see an increase in touchdown rate as well. Now, we might just see this Denver Broncos team lean on their backfield, where Javonte Williams doesn't look great. Jaleel McLaughlin's coming on. Samaje Perine is always kind of that fourth quarter closer for them. But I got to think that as the season progresses and they find themselves playing against some of these softer defenses, we might see Russ throwing a little bit more, and he's starting to look more like the Russ of old. So again, it could just end up being consistent high-end QB2 production, which isn't really too valuable. But I think that we've yet to really see the ceiling for Russ Wilson yet this year.
Now at number 11, we've got Noah Brown here, and this feels like a personal attack because I was highest on Noah Brown. I have him at 7. Daniel, you're right in the middle at 10. Dave, you are I don't want to say all the way out, but you're lowest on Noah Brown here at 15. So I kind of want to hear from each of us because this is a guy that I think could be very divisive amongst fantasy managers. If you had Noah Brown or have him, I think you like him a lot. If you don't have him, you assume he's a flash in the pan. And I think Daniel might just be right here that he's a bit of both, somewhere in the middle. So, Daniel, I want to start with you here. Your take on Noah Brown in the fantasy football playoffs and why you put him at number 10 for your playoff stash.
I like Noah Brown in this offense specifically because he's not only just like this deep threat guy, they can use him in a lot of different ways. And there's been quite a few injuries popping up for the Houston Texans receivers. You got Nico Collins with an injury. You've also had an older Robert Woods who's nursing some injuries as well. So Brown's had to come up and do more, but he's also now injured himself. So we're trying to figure out like he's going to be involved in this offense, but it's like a five-way pie right now, specifically with the way that they use all five of these players and all four of these wide receivers, and then Dalton Schultz, who has been continuing to get more and more involved as the season goes along. Young players love themselves a veteran tight end that catch the ball. I'll tell you right now, Dalton Schultz has been one of the best players in the last like month in terms of continuing to be a valuable player at tight end position. And then you go over and you look at their schedule. It's not the best schedule for the postseason, and they played Tennessee Titans twice, who I believe are they're a better matchup for themselves. I think they're fifth or sixth in fantasy points given up for wide receivers this year. It's going to be more of an in division battle, in my opinion. Though defense is going to play a little bit better. Excuse me. And then you have also the Browns and the Jets in there, but again, they got Titans in 15 and in the week 17 for the championship. So there's a lot of differing factors for this with Noah Brown, but I think my main thing is that he can pop off at any point, and I'm totally okay with that. I'm just a little bit more in between you guys, just trying not to be too ahead of the curve or trying to fade all of his production to this point. I still think he's going to be a guy you can count on to plug into some flex positions if you have injuries, and if the Texans continue to have injuries. I just don't see his consistency continuing to be as impactful as it has been so far.
Dave, really quick, let me hear why you have Noah Brown as number 15 on this list for you.
I mean, really what it comes down to is we saw one game where he boomed, where he got a 75-yard touchdown on busted coverage. We saw another game where he really stepped up big when Nico Collins was out. But outside of that, there really hasn't been too much to write home about as far as Noah Brown goes. I like him as a player. I think he's really good. You know, a lot of people kind of ignored the preseason drumbeat that was coming out. A lot of people are saying that he was ahead of Robert Woods and he was ahead of Tank Dell. And then he got injured, didn't really start the season playing all that much. And then he was slow to ramp up. I just don't know if we're going to see him, well, everybody is healthy, be any more than, like Daniel said, the fourth or fifth option. He might have jumped Robert Woods at this point, but he's behind Dalton Schultz. He's behind Nico Collins. He's behind Tank Dell. So I think he needs multiple injuries to provide consistent fantasy output. And now, he's hurt again, which he was hurt earlier in the season, and he's been hurt a lot throughout his career. So I understand the case for the ceiling here. Back-to-back 150-yard games is nothing to scoff at. He's not a guy that I would want to have to be relying on throughout the fantasy playoffs.
Yeah, and I think so. To give some context to my ranking of putting him up at 7,
It's like a
this was
handcuff almost.
that's what it was for me, right? Like
Yeah,
this
I
is
get that.
Josh Palmer for the Texans now. That if we do miss Nico for any reason, Noah Brown becomes incredibly valuable. If we do miss Tank Dell for any reason, Noah Brown becomes incredibly valuable. CJ Stroud has just shown that he's making things work with these wide receivers. And it kind of feels like all of these stashes, right? They're all kind of dependent on an injury in front of them taking place. So if that happens, I feel like I'd rather have the guy on my team that we've actually seen a little bit of this ceiling. We've seen a guy pop off for over 100 yards. You're right, Dave. He's surpassed Robert Woods in terms of snaps. I think that he's like he at least in week 10, he was right on par with Dalton Schultz in terms of snaps and target per route run rate. It was all very similar. So to me, it's more of like that handcuff scenario there. Speaking of handcuffs, at number 10, we've got Joshua Kelley, running back for the Los Angeles Chargers. And guys, I think we kind of just put him here as a default, as a placeholder, because we had to, because it's okay.
Yes.
If Austin Eckler gets hurt, that's a starting running back on a potentially good offense, and it's really hard to not have
But
him
we
in the
got
top
burned for
12.
3 straight weeks when that happened early in the season.
That's the thing, man, is he got his shot for 3 straight weeks, and he averaged less
And
than
then
5
as a
fantasy points
boom
per
game
game.
as soon as Austin Eckler returns.
It makes no sense, and it's not like he didn't even get the, it was that he was bad, don't get me wrong, but it's
Yeah.
he didn't even get the usage. 0
No.
touchdowns, 1 reception, like, there was nothing went right for Joshua Kelley, so, you know what, I'm actually surprised. I do think that all of us kinda just found a spot for him on this list, and I think we might all agree that he should probably be a little bit lower here. At number 9, Odell Beckham and Rashod Bateman. So I want to ask this. I put him on here as a duo. Is Odell Beckham Jr. the clear cut guy that you'd rather have over Bateman, or is there still a little bit of a mix and match here, Dave?
I mean, Odell looked dang good last week. Like he looked really good. Surprised me with his breakaway speed, with everything he's been able to do. He's been catching touchdowns now over the last few weeks as well. Rashad Bateman is also looking healthier, but his usage is just so inconsistent that I think if I had to pick one of these guys between Odell Beckham Jr. and Rashad Bateman for the rest of the season, I'd prefer Odell Beckham, who's getting more consistent usage. He's seeing more targets and he has shown that he can run a little bit more now than we've seen earlier in the season and even 2 years ago when he was coming back from that injury. So I think Bateman still has that big play upside, but we're also seeing some big play upside from Odell here as well. I'd prefer Odell, and I think we talked about this same exact situation like 2 weeks ago. And at the time, I was really torn, and I think I slightly preferred Rashad Bateman. Really, it just comes down to whether you're looking for consistency or whether you're looking for the spike weeks. And I think you can actually get some decent consistency while still having a high ceiling with Odell.
Now, Daniel, you have this duo ranked the highest amongst us. And it's not like crazy high. You're at 9, I'm at 11, Dave's at 10. So the interesting thing I want to ask here is that Lamar Jackson is he's looking similar to how he did in his MVP season, where he is playing very efficiently without having to give us a lot of passing attempts. And we're
Mhm.
seeing, just taking a look at his last few weeks here, 16 completions, 13 completions, 21 completions, 18 completions. Is this an offense with such a limited passing volume where guys like this can still thrive now that there's potentially no Mark Andrews for the season?
I think that's the big thing here is that there's no Mark Andrews anymore, probably. And even though there's probably a realistic option he comes back in the postseason, Isaiah likely has still produced in that role, but it's not as productive as Mark Andrews. And that's going to allow some more productivity and target concentration for Rashad Bateman, for Zay Flowers, and for Odell Beckham Jr. So I know that it's not the best matchup either for these two players postseason in the fantasy league. You've got, the Rams, the Jaguars, the 49ers, and the Dolphins. It's not the best, but I always try to go for the offense. And I believe that Todd Monken with Lamar Jackson throwing the football to these players without Mark Andrews is going to be able to scheme up these guys just enough to continue to score points and get them in the end zone. So I just kind of default to offense, and I think that they're one of the best in the NFL. So that's why I have them as high as I do.
And we could also lump Isaiah Likely in here too. Why not? Harms, I know
Absolutely.
you're a big
Yeah.
Isaiah Likely guy. He's going to see more opportunities. We talked about him yesterday on the waiver wire show as well. I think that we're seeing the targets kind of get fanned out all over the place right now. And there's
Yeah.
not going to be a ton of consistency from any of these guys, but I think Odell Beckham, Rashad Bateman, and Isaiah Likely are all going to have some value down the stretch here without Andrews.
Now, before we move on to tier number 2, I want to let you guys all know that we've got an awesome Black Friday sale going on here over at Football Guys. You can get 20% off your first year of a Football Guys subscription from now until next Black Friday. And then guess what? You just take advantage of that next Black Friday sale event, and you just keep doing that year after year. And then you have a lifetime discount. You see how you do that? You just turn it back on its head. You got custom tools, rankings, a ton of great advice and articles and great content there over on the Football Guys website. You also get 20% off of Football Guys merchandise. You can get the I'm one beer away from talking about my sleeper tight ends beer glass. There's so much cool stuff over there in the Football Guys shop. The offer ends on Monday, November 27th. You can scan the QR code here on the screen or click the link in the show description and win your league today. Guys, let's move on to tier number 2. Taking a look at this is interesting. We're not seeing as many of the skill guys. So we got 2 defenses and 2 tight ends here. So it kind of feels a little bit like a versus, like a battle. So let's take a look at number 8 and 7 are the Rams DST and Eagles DST. And I do have to say, last night's performance, we're recording this on Tuesday. Last night's performance against the Chiefs did make me move those Eagles up a little bit. I mean, obviously we've seen the Chiefs have their struggles, but the Eagles defense looks like they're starting to get it together here as the season goes on. So, guys, I want to take a look. The Rams defense, their schedule is there right now. They're 31st in the league. It is not a good defense, but the schedule is so enticing in the fantasy playoffs. The Washington Commanders, the New Orleans Saints, potentially with Jameis Winston, who knows? Potentially. And then week 17 against the New York Giants with Tommy DeVito, who, listen, Tommy D threw 3 touchdowns last week. So I don't know, man.
I wrote about him in my trending up section in this week's article. He is improved. Literally, his fantasy output has gone up in every single game he has played so far. I mean, I don't expect that to continue through week 17, but it's tough to ignore.
Same amount of touchdowns as Kenny Pickett in just 4 games. I'm just going to say that.
Nice.
And so it's interesting. So the Rams have what looks like a good schedule, but the Rams defense is not very good. So it could be fool's gold. But then the Eagles, who are 19th, they're kind of middle of the road in terms of defense. Their schedule is Seattle,
Third
which is
worst.
up and down, and then New York Giants, and then Arizona. So this isn't a bad schedule for them, but I'm curious as to where you guys lean on these defenses. Daniel, I'll start with you. If you have to pick between the bad defense with a good schedule and the sort of middle of the road defense with a kind of okay schedule, where are you leaning here?
So I have them rank the Rams just over the Eagles for me, but again, like it's hard to really splice those hairs you got there and try to figure out which one you want. If we're gonna go, I mean, I'm gonna take the players over the schedule when they're like this. That's why I have the Eagles. I mean, that's excuse me, talking over myself. I should have the Eagles over the Rams, and I have the other way because of the schedule. But we're talking about it, watching them last night. It just kind of facilitates that these players are going to ramp up into the postseason. I do worry that maybe they take their foot off the pedal a little bit as they get closer to the real NFL playoffs, where they're trying to like maybe rest some guys up if they're that far in advance. But the Lions right now are going to give them a run for the 1 seed. We'll see how that ends up shaking out. But it's so close. Looking at it now, I probably would take the Eagles over the Rams because of the players and not just the schedule. So I should flip my own rankings now that we're talking about it.
I'm a
Dave,
matchup
how about
sucker.
you?
I'm a matchup sucker when it comes to defenses and special teams. I mean, we see really good defenses struggle to put up points. It's very rare to come across a plug and play defense special team in fantasy. So I'm always looking at the matchups here. And the Rams defense has looked a little bit better as of late. Aaron Donald has, just been his normal self the last few weeks, just looking absolutely dominant out there. And it just comes down to, like we said, the really, really nice schedule for them: Washington, New Orleans, and the Giants. Looking at the football guys' strength of schedule tool for the rest of the season, I know we're talking playoffs here, but if we include weeks 12, 13, and 14, the Rams have the second easiest schedule for the rest of the season behind only the New York Jets. So again, if you're looking for a playoff stash, I like their playoff schedule, but they're also a team that you can pick up and ride into the playoffs as well.
Yeah, honestly, you're right, Dave. The Rams defense is not bad to pick up now. They've got Cleveland in week 13. And, if you're listening to this, while everyone is running out to grab all these other defenses, you can be a week early, get the matchup with the Rams in Cleveland, have that Rams defense going up against Dorian Thompson-Robinson. And then you've got Washington in week 15. You could probably bench them in week 14 against the Ravens, though. And then, I mean, it looks pretty good. So we might see a little run here with Los Angeles Rams defense.
And I just want to say, this is what I love about this football guy's strength of schedule tool, not to just be a total company man here, but you look and it shows every single matchup. It shows how these matchup ranks rank against defenses. And like you said, week 14 against Baltimore is a bad matchup. So all you do then is click on week 14. It sorts by the best matchups in that week. And then you look and you see that New Orleans is playing against Carolina, and Detroit is playing against Chicago, and Jacksonville is playing against Cleveland. And those are the best matchups. So it's really easy to just stream when you can sort off of like the best available matchups on any given week.
You mentioned that, Dave. Sorted it right now. Week 15, first week for most people in the fantasy playoffs. 2 best defenses, according to the strength of schedule tool. Los Angeles Rams at 1, Atlanta
Mhm.
Falcons at 2. So if you
Mhm.
need everyone, it's win or go home in the
I
fantasy
like it.
playoffs. So if you're looking for it, there it is, Rams and Falcons. Head on over to footballguys.com. Check out the custom strength of schedule tool that we've got over there. Gents, let's take a look at the next two players at 6 and 5. We've got a couple of tight ends, Gerald Everett and Pat Freiermuth. And Dave, you told me be ready to defend my Gerald Everett hatred here. I've got Gerald Everett at 8. You each have him at 5,
You hate
and then
him.
I have
Hate him.
Pat Freiermuth at 5, and you guys have him at 6. So
We hate Pat Freiermuth.
you do. You
No.
absolutely despise him.
Clearly, should have just not even
I
included him.
I just kind of look at it this way, guys. With the tight ends, man, like I think we've seen enough of Gerald Everett where we know who he is. And I know that Kenny Pickett isn't very good, but I do think we've seen enough of Pat Freiermuth to know that he can be a top 10, top 8 guy week in and week out, even with a bad quarterback. The target per route run rate was tops on the team when Kenny Pickett was and Pat Freiermuth were healthy and active together. I don't know about Gerald Everett. I mean, we've seen more Donald Parham recently, and so where does the confidence come from with Gerald Everett? Is it mostly just this is a good offense, Justin Herbert is a good quarterback, and you just want a piece of that, Dave?
Sorry, I was muted there. Yeah, that's exactly what it comes down to. I mean, he is looking like the number 2 pass catcher right now in Los Angeles. Quentin Johnson has been terrible. Josh Palmer and Mike Williams are both on IR, and somebody besides Keenan Allen is going to have to catch some passes. And last year we saw some pretty good output from Gerald Everett. I mean, it wasn't anything crazy, but when Mike Williams and Keenan Allen were both hurt, Everett was putting up some pretty solid production. You know, you look throughout the season to start the year 14, 13, and then he had a down week 17.1, 11.3. I mean, he was putting up points last year when those guys were hurt. And this year, Gerald Everett has also been hurt himself. You know, he had a few games where he missed, he had a few games where he was limited, but I just think that he is a very talented tight end. You know, he's somebody that we've seen flashes from throughout his entire career. The opportunity is there. They may have tried forcing some balls Quentin Johnston's way, but I think that that experiment is just about over for this year. You know, we've seen touchdowns kind of be the only thing that Gerald Everett has done this year, but he did have 2 touchdowns before he got hurt and then was limited in the next 2 games, was out last week. But I think when he is 100% healthy and he's the number 2 pass catcher behind Keenan Allen, he's somebody that you can kind of look at as a back end tight end 1.
Now, Daniel, between Gerald Everett and Pat Freiermuth, you've got them ranked back to back. You've got Everett at 5,
Yeah.
Freiermuth at 6. Does the Matt Canada firing change things for you in any way here? Because I think a lot of people are wondering, is this Pittsburgh Steelers offense going to get better now that Matt Canada is gone? Or are we probably in store for much more of the same?
Well, that's all going to depend on what we see going forward, right? I mean, the quarterback is still Kenny Pickett, and Kenny Pickett's not a good quarterback. He's not a good NFL quarterback. And if we see maybe them actually lean into the better running back and show an intelligence factor of using their really good players more often, then yeah, maybe we see that going up a little bit. I have a little bit more trust in Justin Herbert and the offensive part of the coaching staff in the Chargers building right now than I do of whatever's going on the offense in Pittsburgh. And then you look at the fact that they do play the Denver Broncos twice in that stretch. While their defense has been better, they're still first in giving up points to tight ends this year. Then you got the Raiders and the Bills switched in there as well before the week 17 against the Broncos. So personally, there's more Everett with the offense. And the fact of the matter is they're going to have to score points. Their defense is one of the worst in the NFL, if not the worst. And their head coach has said he's not giving up play calling. So it's going to continue to be bad as it goes throughout the season. So I'm just going to count on Justin Herbert having to throw the ball to somebody not named Keenan Allen at some point, and I fall on Gerald Everett being that guy.
Yeah, I mean, you guys make good points. I think I still lean Pat Freiermuth ever so slightly, because I do know that for the Chargers, at some point we're getting Josh Palmer back. At some point, we're also getting Jalen Guyton back, And so I do remember earlier in the season, it was Donald Parham who kept stealing these touchdowns away from Gerald Everett, and that was incredibly frustrating. And it felt like you couldn't really predict it. So I do wonder with the change
Now we
in
got Stone
Pittsburgh.
Smart stealing those touches.
Yeah, man, Stone Smart, the creative player. I do wonder though. I do wonder if in Pittsburgh now with the change in offensive coordinator, change in play calling, there is a curiosity here to hear. Sorry, a curiosity here to use the tight end a bit more, especially. I mean, good matchups against Indy, Cincy, and Seattle. Cincinnati Bengals and Indianapolis Colts are both top 5 in points allowed to tight ends. So I am curious about that. Now, before we go to the final tier, tier 1, the players that you absolutely must stash for the fantasy football playoffs, I want to remind you guys, please go and leave a review for this podcast. Head on over to Apple Podcasts, leave a review for us. You can also go to do it on Spotify as well. Leave us a 5-star review, but on Apple Podcasts, if you leave a 5-star review and leave some kind words there, you know, your thoughts and opinions on this show. Each week, we're going to be selecting a lucky winner to get a free Football Guys Pro subscription. And all you have to do, it's going to take you 15 seconds, put your star rating, drop in a few words, and within usually 48 hours, those show up, Dave. So if you're not picked this week, you might be entered to win next week. So head on over to the podcast app and leave that review now. Guys, let's take a look at tier 1 here, where we got our top 4 players. At number 4, we've got Tyjae Spears, running back for the Tennessee Titans. And this is interesting because he was kind of our clear cut, maybe not clear cut. Daniel and I each had him as the number 4 running back. Dave, you had him at number 3. And Dave, you know how I love to do Twitter polls because Twitter's never wrong. And I ran a Twitter poll asking them which running back they would like to have amongst the running backs that we put here. Tyjae Spears, Tyler Allgeier, or Kenneth Gainwell. Tyjae Spears was number 1 with 60% of the vote as a fantasy playoff stash. So you're highest on Tyjae Spears. Not saying that you put him at number 1, but what made you a little bit higher on Tyjae Spears and kind of closer to the general consensus opinion here?
I mean, I've been talking about it all year. This isn't the same Derrick Henry that we have seen in seasons past. You know, doesn't have the same juice, doesn't have the same tackle breaking ability, career lows in just about every single efficiency metric. Well, meanwhile, Tyjae Spears pops off the screen basically anytime he touches the ball. Now, I don't expect Derrick Henry to get injured, but it is a part of the game. You know, people do get injured. We've seen Derrick Henry pick up some injuries over the last couple of years. And for me, what it comes down to is we've seen Will Levis inject a little bit of offensive production into this system so far. Not that he's been great, but he's been good enough, I think better than Ryan Tannehill. And if something were to happen to Derrick Henry and Tyjae Spears gets his opportunity in this offense, he's got a really nice schedule throughout the playoffs where he gets to face off against Houston, Seattle, and then Houston again. And he could end up being a really, really high ceiling player through those very important weeks.
Now, just for sake of argument here, all of these running backs on this list have very easy playoff schedules. That's the reason that they are here and ranked so high. Tyjae Spears with the number 7 easiest
So here's
playoff
what I'll
schedule,
say.
like you
Out of
said.
the 3, Tyjae Spears, Tyler Allgeier, and Kenneth Gainwell, I think Tyjae Spears is the most talented. How about that?
I wouldn't fight you too hard on that. I think we saw a lot of good from Tyler Allgeier last year.
Mhm.
I think we'll talk more about this, but I think I worry most about that Tennessee Titans offense because Will Levis is just a walking time bomb each week when he goes, and you're not sure which Will Levis you're going to get. But let's take a look at number 3 here. It's a very similar voting that we did. Dave, you put Tyler Allgeier at number 4. Daniel and I each put him at number 3. I think there was just a bit more confidence. We've seen it before with Tyler Allgeier go a full season looking really good, and he's already a guy that gets some goal line work there in Atlanta. So Daniel, I want to ask you, Tyler Allgeier, you put him at 3 ahead of Tyjae Spears. I think at least for me, the big factor was that Tyler Allgeier has the number 1 easiest strength of schedule in the fantasy playoffs. He's got Carolina, Indy, and Chicago. So we never want to predict or hope for injuries, but if something were to happen to Bijan Robinson and Tyler Allgeier as starting running back for the Falcons, it feels like that could be a guy that wins your league, no?
You're not wrong, but let's be real. With Arthur Smith at head coach, it doesn't matter if he gets injured or not,
He's just
because
going to
he might
ruin
just
everything.
end up winning. He might just end up being one of the guys that gets the most touches down the stretch anyway, just because he's feeling like that. And he likes Tyler Allgeier. He talks about why Bijan Robinson doesn't get a lot of red zone targets and touches because, well, Tyler Allgeier is a really good red zone back, and they love having their kind of bowling ball player behind a better offensive line than a Tyjae Spears. Like that. That's why I'm looking at offensive lines for these two, and I think that the Tennessee Titans have one of the worst offensive lines in football.
Yes.
The Falcons have a pretty good offensive line. I would say they're above average. And then the Eagles have one of the best offensive lines in football. So that's where we see these three running backs. And then you have the matchups. And again, with Allgeier just being a guy who could walk off the bench, leading their team in touches, regardless of Bijan Robinson being in Atlanta. I mean, we could also say that Cordell Patterson could lead them in touches at some point, and I don't think I'd be shocked by that.
It's a real fear of mine. That is a legitimate fear of mine that Cordell Patterson starts taking more touches.
And I think that's exactly what it is for me, because last year we did see Tyler Allgeier in what was close to a workhorse role throughout the entire season, but he only saw more than one target in 3 games last year. I mean, he was completely uninvolved in the passing game. Where Tyjae Spears, he can do it both. He can run between the tackles, he can get out in space and catch the ball. So if we're looking at presumed ceilings, we assume, and for the sake of discussion here, talking about playoff stashes, if Derrick Henry and Bijan Robinson were both to go down, I think Tyjae Spears and his involvement in the passing game, his big play upside, just gives him a higher ceiling than Tyler Allgeier. Tyler Allgeier will get a lot of touches, but we joke about Cordell Patterson, but very tongue in cheek. I think Cordell Patterson would come in and see 3 to 5 targets per game and render Tyler Allgeier pretty useless in the passing game.
I might push back a little bit. I mean, we saw Allgeier be pretty good last year, even with Cordell Patterson as a big part of that passing game. So, listen, we're splitting hairs. We've got these guys at 3 and 4. Daniel, I love the point that you made, though, is that the worrisome part for me is that the Tennessee Titans offensive line is just not very good. So I think you're having to hope for a lot of those dump off passes from Will Levis to Tyjae Spears there.
Here's the thing. Tyler Allgeier, he rushed for 1,000 yards, and that's a great accomplishment, but he only averaged 10 PPR points per game. He was the RB29 in scoring last year. So even though he was a workhorse and he was getting, like, in PPR leagues especially, his ceiling was so capped. He was only giving you 10 points per game on the season.
Well, sure, but he also started slow because remember, he was a rookie. There was a bunch of games where he didn't start out the season.
Right.
Where he wasn't playing a whole ton. So we do have to take a lot of these things into consideration. Either way, we're getting at a point here where we're splitting hairs. Like, these guys are valuable regardless. It's kind of I think if you have Derrick Henry, you're stashing Tyjae Spears. If you have Bijan Robinson, you're stashing Tyler Allgeier. Even if you don't, stash
if
him
you got
anyways.
the bench space, stash them both. Why not?
Stash him anyways.
Absolutely.
I love what JJ Zacharyson talks about is not just handcuffing your own guy, because it doesn't necessarily give you that much value. Handcuffing someone else's guy or getting someone else's handcuff on your roster is huge, because now you have a starting running back just hanging out in your flex spot. Let's move here to the running back that we did all decide deserved to be at the top, and that is Kenneth Gainwell, running back for the Philadelphia Eagles. And we saw last night, Monday Night Football, Eagles Chiefs, that DeAndre Swift looked great. He continues to look great, but the thing that when I tweeted out that DeAndre Swift has looked phenomenal and where he's ranking and all that, first response I got on Twitter, because Twitter's a happy place, is that, yeah, bro, but he's always hurt. Well, we do have to keep that into consideration here.
Everyone's injury prone until they aren't.
Yeah, we got to think about that. So without DeAndre Swift there, Dave, does Kenneth Gainwell become instantly the number 1 running back that you want out of this group? I mean, we all ranked him there. How good could he really be if DeAndre Swift misses time?
I think he'd quickly fall into close to a workhorse role. I mean, Rashod Penny has been healthy scratches. Seems like he's not going to do anything. Boston Scott is going to be somewhat involved, but I think that they trust Kenneth Gainwell to take on the bulk of the carries if something were to happen to DeAndre Swift. And, we talk about it. He's got the 3rd easiest schedule through the playoffs, but again, looking ahead of the playoffs, there aren't many teams that have better matchups. He gets Buffalo, he gets Dallas, which should be a shootout. So if something were to happen to DeAndre Swift, I think we start looking at Kenneth Gainwell as a top 12, top 15 running back immediately.
Yeah, and it's not just, that the offense is so good, but Daniel, this is a team that their schedule for the playoffs for running backs is 3rd easiest. They've got Seattle Seahawks, New York Giants, Arizona Cardinals. And to have the Arizona Cardinals, which I believe are bottom 3 against fantasy running backs as your championship matchup, that feels, I mean, you kind of don't want to count your chickens before they hatch here, but are you guys like, do you look at the beginning of the playoffs and say, I got to win week 1? Or do you sometimes look ahead and say, I think I'm good enough to win week 1 and 2 of the playoffs? Who's going to put me over the edge and give me that championship?
I mean,
I think you kind of have to. Yeah, this is not about I can win week 3, right? No, we're trying to go down the tiers. Like you want to win the whole thing, right? You have to assume at some point, if you're in the postseason, how are you going to match up in the actual championship match? So you want these matchups. And honestly, Kenneth Gainwell might be a guy that starts that game, regardless of what happens with injury or not. Because let's just put a scenario out there that the Philadelphia Eagles have locked up the number 1 seed. Do you think that they'll rest some players like DeAndre Swift, who's had injury bugs throughout the rest of his career? That would be something they look to do. Maybe get Kenneth Gainwell more touches in that game anyway. So he might hold standalone value without even needing an injury in that specific game. And Kenneth Gainwell is a guy who, again, doesn't necessarily matter. DeAndre Swift has been the workhorse guy. It just takes one game for them to just say, hey, okay, take a break, DeAndre. We're gonna let Kenny kind of handle it here. So you absolutely have to look ahead to that championship game. And because he plays Arizona in a game that literally might be meaningless to the Philadelphia Eagles in terms of their starters, we're talking about Kenneth Gainwell could end up putting a bunch of points in that game anyway.
Let's go to our number 1 player that we think fantasy managers need to stash for the fantasy playoffs. And it's Jaxon Smith-Njigba. And Dave, I think you said it best before the show started.
One of
How
these
in the
things is
world,
not like the other.
how is he available in 40% of leagues? What are we doing, guys? Get Jaxon Smith-Njigba on your roster. I know that throughout the season here, it's been a little slow goings, up and down. He had a few weeks here and the role started to grow. He's been averaging 11 fantasy points per game since week 6. That role continues to grow. We often see that with rookie wide receivers. And, well, the Seattle Seahawks have the number 1 easiest strength of schedule in the fantasy playoffs for wide receivers. They've got the Philadelphia Eagles, Tennessee Titans, and Pittsburgh Steelers for those final 3 weeks. So, Dave, you say one of these things is not like the other. I know that we kind of have an idea of what JSN's value is with DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, but those 2 wide receivers have also been nursing injuries. It feels like every single week they are questionable. So if one of those guys is missing, how valuable does Jaxon Smith-Njigba become?
Yeah, sky high ceiling here. We're already seeing it start to ramp up a little bit. I mean, over the last 5 weeks, 11.5 points per game. He's averaging just as many points as Nico Collins, Deontay Johnson, Josh Downs, Rashee Rice, Chris Godwin, Jacoby Myers, like guys that people are plugging into their lineups without any hesitation. JSN is scoring just as many points as them, and he's on an upward trajectory. So I think he's a guy that even if Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf are healthy, he's already shown unbelievable skills that are translating to an NFL field. We got to remember too that in the preseason, he broke his wrist, right? I know some sort of injury that put him out for like over a month. So he missed critical time in the preseason. He missed the start of the year. He was slow to ramp up with this injury. So yeah, it's taken some time. We know it takes time for rookies to warm up. When rookies get injured in the preseason, it takes them even more time. This guy was the unanimous wide receiver 1 in this class. He's starting to look like he belongs in the NFL. Like I said, just doesn't really fit with the rest of the guys that we're talking about that are kind of, we need some injuries for this guy to find relevance. JSN, he could end up doing the same thing that we've seen Brandon Ayuk do his rookie year and that we saw Monra St. Brown do his rookie year, and where we see these rookies just come on in the second half of the season. If JSN is available in your league, just stop listening to the show right now, flip to your Sleeper app or your ESPN app or whatever it is, and pick him up and keep him stashed.
Daniel, I know you're a big film evaluator and you take a look at the incoming draft classes every single year. You're actually headed to the Senior Bowl this year, so that's going to be a cool experience for you. Jaxon Smith-Njigba, I know he was a lot of people's wide receiver 1 for this rookie class. Was he yours as well?
He was. And I mean, when you look at what he's able to do, there's multiple times where he's kind of been missed on wide open touchdowns too. Though we're talking about fantasy points that should have been, and that's probably why he's not on people's rosters, which still makes no sense. Like, he should be on everybody's roster. There's players, we talked about Noah Brown, Tutu Atwell, which I guarantee you are on rosters right now. if he's out there and you have a Noah Brown or a Tutu Atwell, what are we doing here? What are we doing here? We have
What
to
are we doing?
understand that Tutu Atwell, nice speed player. He's finally figuring it out in his 3rd year in the NFL. Jaxon Smith-Njigba not only was the best wide receiver in this last draft class, he'd be up with just about any of these top wide receivers of the last multiple drafts, except Marvin Harrison Jr., who, funny enough, was his teammate at Ohio State. They just keep cranking these guys out. And Jaxon Smith-Njigba, I think, becomes, if we're talking 1 to 2 scenarios here, with the injuries, he becomes more valuable if DK Metcalf goes down, in my opinion, if he's not playing the game, because Tyler Lockett's role is never, ever going to be JSN's role ever, guys. I know there's some people that tried to say, well, if Tyler Lockett gets hurt, which he, typically does, bump up for JSN. No, it's the opposite. It's if DK Metcalf has to miss a game or 2 here, he takes that kind of role because he can separate on the outside, run all the slot routes and do everything like that and create separation. So the talent level that we're talking about with him compared to everybody else on this stash list is completely different. That's what David's talking about. They're very different players. He is a guy who we're going to find out transcends a lot of this going forward. And I'm excited to see what he does going, and not just this year, but next year and after that.
And Daniel, I'm saying, I know you were saying like public perception is that Tyler Lockett is always hurt. And that certainly is the story that we hear with Tyler Lockett, but I think he belongs to be in that category with like DeAndre Hopkins and T.Y. Hilton, where he's always banged up and he's always limited in practice.
Yeah, for sure.
Tyler Lockett has missed 3 games in
Yeah.
his career. He has been playing since 2015 and has missed 3 career games. And yeah, there are some games where maybe he comes out and he's not 100% and he's kind of gimpy and used a little bit of a decoy. But this dude is an Iron Man. Like I said, put him up there with DeAndre Hopkins and T.Y. Hilton as a guy who just always suits up regardless of the injuries that he's dealing with.
Man, guys, I hope that everyone watching or listening to this is going to be able to get ahead of the rush as more and more teams start to figure out they are going to make the fantasy playoffs. We got week 12 coming up. This is kind of the perfect time to start grabbing these guys off your waiver wire. If you still haven't had your trade deadline, and maybe you've got that fantasy manager who knows they're not making the playoffs and they've got Jaxon Smith-Njigba on their roster, maybe make a deal. Some of you guys out there still have some open availability for trades here, but Dave and I are going to be back again later on this week. I hope everybody enjoys their Thanksgiving this week. Guys, you going to have a fun Thanksgiving? Are you going house to house like I am?
We're hosting this year, deep frying a turkey for the first time ever. So wish us luck.
Oh, Dave,
staying at home,
burn the house down.
Wife, kid, me, that's it. We're not doing anything crazy this year. We don't live near my family or her family, so it's just going to be a nice little watch football, get the smoker going. That's for the mac and cheese. My wife does the turkey, but yeah, I'm excited.
And before we wrap up the show, I just want to say we've been talking about playoff must stashes. It was so hard for me not to make a Raleigh Fingers 1974 World Series joke. So maybe we could put him on the thumbnail or something. I did. I had to stick it in there.
But you did.
Let's get Raleigh Fingers on the thumbnail for YouTube if we can. Maybe.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, I'll put in that request with the graphics department. All right, well, we'll see you guys later on in the week. Thank you so much, as always, to my co-host Dave Kluge. Thanks to our special guest today, Daniel Harms, and our production team over here, Julia, Dylan, Jagger. You guys are awesome, and thanks to all of you for listening and watching all the way through. We'll see you next time. Adios.